Good morning, guys. As you are getting settled, I would encourage you to grab your Bibles and go ahead and open them to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8 is where we will be this morning, starting in verse 1 here in just a second. If you've been with us for the last few months, you will know that we've kind of jumped in and out of this series, but we've been going through the Gospel of Mark since kind of the end of last year. And we are finally in chapter 8. Chapter 8 is kind of a pivotal moment as we'll get to, not necessarily in this sermon, but in a few weeks, hopefully, for the Gospel of Mark, where it kind of changes the focus and starts moving us towards Jesus heading towards Jerusalem. But what we're going to look at today is almost a lot of times people use like repetition to help people learn. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a situation where you're trying to explain something to someone and you just see the glaze kind of go over their face, like they're totally 100% not getting this. I feel like that a lot of times when I'm up here sometimes, but just the glaze gets on there. But if you grew up in a household similar to mine, my dad is a very intelligent man, and he knows where things are at, but he doesn't always understand or know how to tell you where things are at. And so we would be doing something, we'd be out, fixing something or whatever, and we would need a certain tool, or he would need more screws or nails or whatever, and he would say, okay, so you go into the shop, and if you go straight back and you look to your right, it's on the second shelf, it might be behind some, and I know that on my brother's face and my face, it was just total non-understanding at all. Like, we're just like, what are you even talking about? I don't even know, like, where you're even mentioning right now. If you were anything like me, you've probably experienced that. You've probably experienced it at your work or probably with your kids as well, or anything like that. That just this kind of thing of this idea that we just don't get it. Somebody's trying to explain something to us, but it is either going over our heads or it's just going in one ear and out the other. And that's kind of where we're going to end up this morning, as Jesus is once again going to kind of go through a cycle here in Mark. And basically how we're going to look at it this morning is that we're going to look at Jesus' interactions with three different groups of people. We're going to look at Jesus and the crowd, Jesus and the Pharisees, and then Jesus and his disciples, just to kind of give you a look ahead at where we're going this morning. But to do that, let's look here at Mark chapter 8, and we're going to read the first 21 verses of this chapter. And follow along with me. It says, "In those days there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. He called the disciples and said to them, 'I have compassion on the crowd, because they have already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come a long distance.' The disciples answered him, 'Where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people?' 'How many loaves do you have?' he asked them. 7, they said. He commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. Taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. So they served them to the crowd. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he said these were to be served as well. They ate and were satisfied. Then they collected 7 large baskets of leftover pieces. About 4,000 were there. He dismissed them, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, 'Why does this generation demand a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation.' Then he left them, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to take bread, and had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. Then he gave them strict orders, 'Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.' They were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Aware of this, he said to them, 'Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? Do you have eyes and do not see? Do you have ears and not hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of leftovers did you collect?' 12, they told him. when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, don't you understand yet? So as we look at this and as we have read through it, you may think, well, didn't we just talk about this? Just a few weeks ago, and really in my Bible, you can flip one page back, it might be the same in yours, you're going to see a very similar story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And now we have another story of Jesus feeding the 4,000. But what we see here is not just Mark getting things wrong, but Mark using different stories out of the life of Jesus to help us understand something about who he is. So we're not going to look all that deeply into Jesus' feeding of the 4,000 because the message is very similar. I would encourage you to go back and listen to Matt's sermon on that a few weeks ago. I looked back through it as I was preparing for this, and it was just really good. But there are a few things that I would like for us to see, because in this whole cycle, if we go back to chapter 6, you see Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus crossing the waters, Jesus interacting with the Pharisees, Jesus performing a miracle, Jesus then having a proclamation made about him. And that's kind of where we ended last week in verse 37, where it says they were extremely astonished and said, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. And now Mark is going to redo this again in chapter 8 of Jesus feeding a crowd, Jesus going across the water, the Sea of Galilee, Jesus interacting with the Pharisees, and eventually, as we get towards the end of the chapter in a later date, we're going to get to the peak proclamation of who Jesus is from what Peter says. But Mark is doing this to help us kind of understand. He does it a little bit quicker this time to show us, once again, just to remind us of who we're dealing with and why Jesus is the focus of the book that he is writing here. And he does this in this first way by, once again, using the story of Jesus feeding the 4,000 to display, again, who Jesus is. In the previous sermon about the 5,000, Matt spent time talking about a compassion-driven mission, and that's still the idea here. But we're going to look at, very quickly, just 3 ways that Jesus, once again, displays who he is in feeding these people. There are some differences here that we can kind of look at to say, okay, this is definitely a different group, because in the previous story of the feeding of this multitude, it is in a Jewish area of Galilee, and it's mainly Jewish people that are there. If we are continuing along with this story, Jesus has been in Tyre and Sidon, which are north of Israel in this time, and he is still there, and he is actually, if we look back at the end of chapter 7, he is in the region of the Decapolis, which is a Gentile predominant region. So it's a different group of people, and the words used here are different as well. As you'll see at the end of this verse 9, it says about 4,000 were there. When we looked at the 5,000, it was saying it was 5,000 men that were there, so we could assume there were a lot more people. But this is an all-inclusive word here, so there was a total of 4,000 people that Jesus had here. In the previous story, they were there for 1 day that Jesus has been teaching. And in this story, Jesus says that they've actually been there for 3 days listening to Jesus talk. I know that you guys don't want to listen to me much more than the 25 minutes and probably 30-ish that I'm actually going to go. But for the fact that they've been sitting there for 3 days listening to Jesus teach, even if they brought food with them from their homes, they would have run out of food by this point. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's looking out over the crowd. They've been with him for these 3 days, and now he needs to move on. The teaching is done, but he doesn't want to send them away and have them just collapse on their way home. And so that's why he calls the disciples to him, and he asks them this question. If we send them away, they will collapse because some of them have come a long distance. And then the disciples respond with, where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? If you look back at the previous story about Jesus feeding the 5,000, we can see hopefully a subtle shift here in the disciples' questions. Previously, they come to him and they say, Jesus, the people are hungry. We need to send them away. And Jesus says, well, you feed them. And they're basically like, we could get $200 or 200 denarii, which would be almost a full year's salary worth of food, and it wouldn't feed all of these people. They're asking, why should we even feed these people? And yet here, through what Jesus has shown them and what they've gone through the last few chapters of Mark, they've begun to ask the how question. Not why should we feed these people, but how are we going to go about feeding these people? And I think that they are starting to understand, and we're going to get to the end of this where they still are struggling, but I think they're starting to understand who Jesus is, what he's come to do. And they understand that, hey, we can't feed these people, so how are we going to go about doing this? And then they trust in what Jesus is going to do for them. But the couple of things that we see about what Jesus displays of himself and who he is are these. The first is that he is the bread of life. So he feeds these people with 7 loaves and a few small fish. Basically, and as I was thinking through this, it felt like it would be an old, like when we would go fishing with my dad, and you'd have a sleeve of crackers and a can of sardines. It's basically what it feels like he had. It was very few loaves of bread, and the way that they talk about the fish here are that they're very small, kind of more bone than meat fish. And so what Jesus does as he's handing these out and feeding all of these people is truly miraculous. But he's doing more than just feeding them. He is displaying that he himself is the bread of life. If you were to flip over to the Gospel of John, after this story, John has Jesus give a longer explanation of what's going on here. And in chapter 6 of John, verse 48, it says, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that anyone may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. And I think that's important for us to remember right now as we are entering into kind of this Easter week, that these folks that were here, that were hungry, that had been with Jesus for 3 days, that needed filling physically, Jesus is not only offering that, but he's offering the ability to be filled spiritually. As the bread of life, he is the one that can fully satisfy us. He is the one who can fully free us. Once again, he says that anyone may eat of it and not die. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. If we come to Jesus, and once again, he is here physically displaying a spiritual truth to those that are around him, that if you look at verse 8, it says that they ate and they were satisfied. If you go back to the previous story of the 5,000, it says they ate and they were satisfied. It's not just a small little thing, but he's showing that, yes, I can feed you physically, but more importantly, I can feed you and fill you and satisfy you in the innermost depths of who you are. And that is what he is displaying here. So not only is he the bread of life, but he is the bread of life for both Jew and Gentile. We see this hinted at throughout the Old Testament, but we see here in the feeding of the 5,000 a predominantly Jewish audience. The feeding of the 4,000 a predominantly Gentile audience. And the stories before this, as Matt went through last week with this Gentile woman asking for Jesus to heal her daughter, we see that Jesus came not just for the Jews, but also for the whole world. That he doesn't limit his ministry to just one ethnic group that he was a part of, but he is coming to revolutionize the world, to affect all people, and to bring all to him. he has compassion on both groups of these people. Once again, if we were to flip over to John chapter 6, he says that no one who comes to me will be hungry, and no one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. So his message and his proclamation, the reason that he came isn't just because, or isn't just for one small group of people, but it's for the entire world. And lastly, just in this little bit, we see that the supply always meets and exceeds the demand. Go back to verse 8. It says, they ate and they were satisfied. Then they collected 7 large baskets of leftover pieces, and about 4,000 were there. So he takes 7 loaves and a few small fish. 4,000 people eat, and not just have a little snack, but they were satisfied. They were full. They were filled. And then they go around and collect, and they have 7 large baskets left over after this. In the previous story, we see that they have 12 baskets. It's interesting, the words that are used there as well. The previous story, it was smaller baskets that people would just kind of, almost like a lunchbox, is what they were talking about there, that Jewish folks would carry around with food in it. The word here, and it's translated as large baskets, were very large baskets. It's the same idea if you're familiar with the story of Paul in the book of Acts being lowered from the walls of Damascus to escape the town. It's the same basket. So it's a man-sized basket that they fill up with leftovers. And so we see here that not only does Jesus meet the needs of the people, but he far exceeds any need that they would ever have. And that is and should be very comforting to us in knowing that none of us here have asked God for more than he wants to actually provide. He looks out on the crowd and he has compassion on them because they're hungry. And so he provides food, and he provides so much food that there's left over. We go to him and we ask for maybe little things, maybe big things, but we've never asked for something so big that God can't accomplish it. We've never asked for something so big that he can't do even more and beyond what we even ask for in our own hearts and in our lives and in the lives of others. And I'm sure that we can think of plenty of times that God has far exceeded what we think that we deserve or what we even have asked for. And we too, like the disciples, can say, look at what he's done. Look at this. He fed 4,000 people, and we have a tremendous amount left over. So why are we concerned so many times about going to him with our things and saying, God, I know this isn't very big, but maybe you can take a look at it? When we can say and understand and know that God cares, he has compassion on us because we have a need, and he wants to fulfill it, and he wants to fulfill us. And so all of this kind of comes down to this idea that in Jesus we find fulfillment, that Jesus shows who he is in this story of feeding the 5,000. But this section doesn't really end here, because in typical Mark fashion, verse 10, it says, immediately he got into the boat and he went to this district of Dalmanutha. No one's really sure exactly where this is, but it seems to be across the Sea of Galilee. And since he runs straight into a bunch of Pharisees, back into kind of like a Jewish area. And so now we see that Jesus interacts with a group who truly refuses, not just doesn't understand, but refuses to understand who he is. So after he goes across the sea, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, demanding of him a sign from heaven to test him. I think we can, I've been around long enough, most of you have been around long enough to know the tone that people ask us questions. One of the things that I hated the most in high school, college, seminary, wherever it was, were the folks who we would go through a topic, and then they would raise their hand and say, I have a question. And their question consisted of a long series of statements to display the fact that they had read this book or that book, or that they understand the topic, or, it was all about what they wanted. Or you could understand when somebody raised their hand and they said, look, I don't, this is what I think this is that correct? We can tell the difference between the tone and the tenor of a question. And since it's hard to read that, Mark does a really good job of showing us how the Pharisees came. The Pharisees came wanting to argue. The Pharisees came in demand. And the Pharisees came to test Jesus. And Mark, we don't see it necessarily here, but the way that Mark talks about this, the word test there is the same word that he uses of Satan testing Jesus in the wilderness. He's connecting the Pharisees kind of almost accosting or attacking Jesus as he's getting off the boat, it feels like, in the same way that Satan tempts Jesus in the wilderness to test him. And they come and they demand a sign from heaven. And Jesus' response is a deep sigh. So in the previous story that we just looked at, he sees a crowd who is hungry, who needs truth, who needs answers, who needs life. And he has compassion. And now he is confronted with a group who is demanding, who is accusing, and he just sighs deeply within himself. I tend to be a sigher at work, things are frustrating me. But this is more than that. This is do you not understand? How can you not understand? And his response is that, why does this generation demand a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Because here's the deal. If we look back in the previous 7 chapters of Mark, what do we see? We see Jesus coming and proclaiming. We see Jesus throwing out demons from multiple people. We see Jesus healing a leper. We see Jesus feeding the 5,000. We see Jesus teaching in parables. We see Jesus bringing a little girl back from death. We see Jesus healing a woman of bleeding. We see all of these different things. We see Jesus walking on water. We see all of these things, and yet these Pharisees are coming to him saying, we need a sign. Show us that you're truly God. I found a couple of verses, and I've got them up here on the screen that might help us to see this. The first one, Isaiah 35. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. For water will gush in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. Isaiah 11:10 says, in that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. Psalm 78 says, my people hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from old. What else did the Pharisees need to understand who Jesus was? They had the Old Testament. They had memorized most of the Old Testament. These are quotes about the coming Messiah that Jesus fulfills. Blind people seeing, deaf people hearing, lame people walking, mute people singing for joy, and yet they come to him and say, show us a sign. One commentator put it this way. He says that the integrity of his life, the integrity of Jesus' life, the truth of his words, and the hope of his acts do not convince, then nothing else will. Nothing else will. Jesus had proven, Jesus had taught, Jesus had proclaimed, he had healed, and yet these people would still not believe. If he called down fire from heaven right then, they would have walked away and said, this man's a demon. I went through Revelation a couple of years ago with my missional community, and over again, this is the one thing that stood out to me that time that I went through it, is that even at the end of all things, as the judgments are being carried out across the globe, people are still denying Jesus. People are still refusing to believe in God. There are some people who will refuse to understand who Jesus is, and that's the picture that we have here with the Pharisees. And nothing that Jesus could have done, nothing that Jesus could have said in that moment would have changed their minds one bit. And let's see why. Go on to verse 14. Because he left them, got back in the boat, and went to the other side. He doesn't even try. Basically, as he told his followers in an earlier chapter, he shakes off the dust from his sandals. He turns around and leaves. And so as he's doing this, they get back in the boat. And I don't know if Mark's trying to be funny here or if it's just working out that way, but it says that the disciples had forgotten to take bread. They just fed 4,000 people and had 7 huge baskets left over. And yet here they've rowed across the sea. Now they're going to row back somewhere else. And they got 1 loaf of bread for the 13 of them. And you're just like, I mean, guys, like, to pack up something, like take a to-go box or something. I don't know. But as they are rowing back across the ocean or the sea, Jesus is probably sitting there contemplating the 2 events that have just happened. This feeding of the 4,000, his interaction with the Pharisees, and yet his disciples are there and they're worried about some bread, as we're going to see. I mean, rowing back and forth, I've never done that. I'm sure that you do need to eat. But Jesus is on one level, he's thinking in a certain way. The disciples are following him, and I think they want to think that way, but they haven't been able to yet. And Jesus is going to point that out for them here. Verse 15, he says, he gave them strict orders. Watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And he's doing this because he sees that they're talking about bread. Any good teacher sees an illustration and then kind of jumps on it to help us think more spiritually, to think higher thoughts. And that's what Jesus is doing here, and the disciples just don't get it. Jesus says, he hears them talking about bread, and he says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, beware the leaven of Herod. And what he means here is leaven, this idea of yeast, is a kind of standard, typical Jewish illustration of sin in someone's life. It started way back with the Passover, where they were commanded to have unleavened bread because they had to get out of Egypt. And so yeast and leavening became a sign of impurity, of evil, and of sin in their lives as an illustration. Mainly because, and if you've done any baking, I enjoy baking. Bread always scares me, though, and I don't do a good job at it because of the yeast. You don't ever know if it's going to work or not to start with, but what's amazing is you take this tiny little bit of yeast and you throw it into flour and water and you mix it all together, and if everything works right, it expands and it blows up. And this tiny little bit of yeast, these few little particles of leavening that you put into this go throughout the whole thing, and it causes the whole thing to rise. And so when Jesus is using this, he's saying these tiny little particles that you may have in your mind, in your heart, can affect all of who you are. And so when he says, where the yeast of the Pharisees, as we've seen over and over again about the Pharisees, in Mark, the Pharisees are legalists. They are more concerned about the rules and the regulations rather than about a life spent in worship of God. The bits and pieces that we've heard and learned about Herod is that Herod is all about power. Herod is all about materialism. He was the king. He was the one who killed, had John the Baptist beheaded a few chapters earlier. And so Jesus is saying, watch out for these things. Watch out for the tiny bits of unbelief or the tiny bits of, we'll say it, I guess now, like non-biblical, unbiblical teaching that may affect your mind and your heart, because those tiny little bits that you may not think are that important can blow up and ruin your life. I'm sure that all of us here in this room today could think of at least one person who at one time was following after the Lord with their whole heart. And then one little bit of unbelief, one little bit of wrong practice, one little bit of distraction by the world got in their heart. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it expanded. And now they no longer care anything about who God is, what Christ has done for them. That's what Jesus is warning the Pharisees about here. But yet they still don't get it. Verse 16, they were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. And I'm sure they were wondering, why is he talking about the Pharisees and Herod when we don't have any bread to eat? But what does he do? He then says, he asks them 9 different questions. The first one, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Don't you remember who's in the boat with you? I just fed 4,000 people. If we needed more bread in the boat, I can handle it. Why do you think I'm talking about actual physical bread when I'm talking about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod? Do you not understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? He quotes from Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Do you have ears that do not see? Do you have ears that do you have eyes and do not see? Do you have ears and not hear? Do you not remember? And then he says, how much was left over when I fed the 5,000? 12 baskets. How much was left over when I fed the 4,000? 7. And you can kind of, in my brain, I can kind of picture like when they know the answer, like they're like 12, So like, yes, we know, but he's saying, don't you remember? Don't you remember what I've done? Don't you remember what I've said, what I've talked about, the miracles that I've performed, and yet you still are struggling to understand? And I think he knows that sometimes it just takes extra time for some people to do this. And through these questions, he's kind of banging their head and saying, don't you understand? Because they've gotten so focused in on, okay, we've got to get to this other town, or why didn't anybody bring any bread, that they can't think of Jesus as who he is and who he's shown himself to be. They want to understand, but they can't get it yet. Luckily, in just a few short verses, Peter gets it. As we'll read about in a few weeks. If you look just over, well, I'll spoiler alert, but look, verse 29. It says, but you, he asked them, who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. You are the Messiah. That's what he's trying to get them to understand here on this boat by saying, don't you remember? How are you not understanding? And we may be able to look at these guys and say, what a bunch of dummies. They've been walking around with Jesus. How do they not get it? But when I look at this, and as I was thinking through it this week at verse 21, the question, don't you understand? And all I could hear was, Kirk, don't you understand yet? Don't you understand? How is it that you're not getting this? Don't you remember, Kirk, what I've done for you? The prayers that I've answered, the way that you've seen me work in people's lives that you've put me in? Kirk, don't you understand yet? And that's the question that we're going to have to leave with this morning. It's the question that I put to each and every one of you in the room. Don't you understand? Don't you remember what God has done? Because there may be some of you in the room that have never said yes to Jesus before, and you've been sitting in here and you've been going through Mark with us, and you've heard all of these great things that Jesus has done, all the healings, all of the teaching that he's done, the parables that he's gone through, the miracles that have been shown. And that's the question. Do you understand yet? Do you understand that Jesus is the Messiah, the one who has come to bring us back into relationship with him? That we've sinned, we've put ourselves far away from God, and because of what we're going to celebrate in 7 days, he dies in our place. He takes the penalty of sin on his back so that we can have life through him. Or maybe you're in here today and you've been a Christian for years and years, and you've forgotten. You're like these disciples. He says, don't you remember how much was left over when I fed 5,000? How much was left over when I fed 4,000? If I was talking about material, physical things, I can take care of that. I'm talking about spiritual things. Have you been so distracted by the world around you, by the things happening in our world, in your life, the calendar that you have to keep, that you have forgotten who Christ is, what he can do, where he can take you? Today's the day to say, I'm trying to understand. I want to understand. Jesus will honor that choice. Jesus will honor that heart. So as we come here in just a few minutes and join together in response, that's where we are. Maybe you need to say yes to Jesus, and maybe you need to say, yeah, I remember what you've done. Help me now to understand where you have me going. Let's pray.